Thank you so much. That's great. Great to see so many of you here. Thank you so much for coming and spending time with us. I know we are what's left before you get a drink, so we'll be very quick. But we are basically talking about the future of innovation and entrepreneurship, two of the biggest buzzwords that you hear about. So I won't let the panel introduce themselves, but I will ask you to sort of talk a little bit about yourselves when you get to answer the first question. But why don't we start with the first question, and that is, are geographical places of tech innovation increasingly consolidating, or are they dispersing when you talk about the rest of other places other than Silicon Valley, Boston, London? What's happening? So I'll start with Laura. Actually, I'll start with you, because given your role, what is the answer?
What is the answer? So thanks so much, Gerard. So I'm Laura Citron, and I'm CEO of London & Partners, which is the growth agency for London. So I can give you quite a local view on what's happening. And my answer, Gerard, is neither dispersing nor converging, but rather organizing. Tech ecosystems are becoming more organized and more orderly. So what we're seeing in London is really three trends, I think, for the next decade or so. The first is that our innovation districts are becoming more clearly defined, and we have these key innovation districts where we have that triple helix. We have great academic institutions with commercialization and the public sector. In the Knowledge Quarter in White City, around oncology in Sutton, in the Olympic Park, South Bank. And they, for the first time in the last couple of years, they have governance, they are getting organized, they are being deliberate and proactive about building innovation districts. And that's new, and I think we'll see that continue. The second thing we're seeing is concentric circles of growth around innovation districts. So we have these small, very tight innovation districts where the really intensive R&D and the early stage commercialization happens in these tight neighborhoods that you can walk across them in 10 minutes. But then what we're starting to see is these concentric circles around them. So a little further out, you see the scale-up space and the larger stage, later stage commercialization. And then I think we'll start to see beyond that, further out of the city, prototyping and advanced manufacturing value chains. And the best example of that I can think of from a London perspective is if you read Imperial College's new strategy, they talk about what they call the West Tech Corridor, which is this idea of a cone radiating from their campuses in South Kensington and at White City out across northwest London and beyond to Reading and Slough and Oxford. So that idea of concentric circles is the second trend we see. And then the third is connections to other major tech clusters. And as London, we've always believed that we will only succeed as part of a European technology ecosystem. And we're increasingly building those links proactively. Local Globe is doing a lot of work on this idea of a new Palo Alto. There's the European Climate Tech Supercluster. Some of these ideas are quite nascent, but I think we'll start to see real traction in this idea of joining up different European technology clusters to be stronger together.
Great start. Excellent. So more organizing. Alan, you're based in San Francisco. Some would say the Mecca of innovation of our time. Not in the past, obviously, but now. Would you agree with that? Or would you say that actually it's got more competition than ever before?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Okay.
Well, I'll expand. I do live in Silicon Valley, but I work for an incredible organization called Endeavor that believes fundamentally entrepreneurs are everywhere and that talent is sort of equally distributed all around the world. The thing that has not been well distributed historically are the networks of know-how, knowledge, capital that can help entrepreneurs build and scale companies. And so for years, people would all move to Silicon Valley and come from everywhere. Our view is that that actually is changing, where folks still do move to Silicon Valley or move to London or move to some of these hubs, but more and more, you can actually build a billion-dollar company from anywhere. And you have more examples of this every year with things like UiPath coming from Romania. Endeavor is really big believers that you can do this all over the world. So we work in markets like Brazil and Indonesia and Nigeria, but here in the European context, we're quite excited about what's happening in Southern Europe, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Eastern Europe, markets like Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. We really do think there's a lot happening in all these places. And so I guess my best answer to your question is there is more competition than ever, and that's a healthy and good thing. But there's also more capital and more opportunity than ever before for entrepreneurs.
So the capital is finding its way to the people who have the potential, more and more.
More and more.
Yeah.
Now, imperfect financing ecosystems, right? So you need kind of staged financing all along the way, and it's not that it's all perfectly distributed everywhere, but I think more and more the very best entrepreneurs are able to find and tap into networks like Endeavor's or like those of the top venture funds and really get what they need to build and grow.
Andrea, a great contrasting view. Would you agree?
Well, you're in charge of being controversial, I guess.
Yes, exactly. So I'm Andrea Traversone, the managing partner of the NATO Innovation Fund, which is a fund where my investors are actually 24 European sovereign wealth fund, and we invest in early stage deep tech across these 24 nations in Europe applied to defense, security, and resilience. So in reply to your question is, to me, what is important, which is a little bit of what we just heard, which is the likelihood of finding the next big home run different than it was 10 years ago? And the answer is definitely yes. It's equally likely that you'll find a $10 billion company in Turkey like Trendyol as you find in the UK. So to me, it's much more about the likelihood of that company emerging, which means that we have to cover many more markets. And so that is what I think has changed.
Just on that point, though, do you want them to move, though? If let's say you do find them in somewhere X, Y, Z, do you want them to move, or do you think where they are? And I'm saying not a capital city, not Boston, not Bangalore, not Shenzhen, but somewhere in the middle of nowhere. You would leave them there?
Fundamentally, what has happened is that it doesn't really matter. Why? Because most companies, particularly after COVID, have become distributed. I cannot think of any startup these days that is started in a city it doesn't hire remotely. Okay, I was with a semiconductor company just before coming here that we are founding and that we're working with, and they're hiring a team in the south of Greece. Turns out that the University of Athens has got some of the best mathematicians in Europe. There's some of the best AI, ML engineers. Skyscanner has got their machine learning team there, and they're hiring a team there.
Yeah. So
these days, companies are totally distributed, and geography is not an issue anymore.
Gerard, I think the best way to think about it is they don't have to move, right? They still can, right? Like plenty of people still want to live in California or live in London, but it's not the only option. You know, the most recent investment we made with our Endeavor Catalyst Fund announced yesterday is in a company called Harbor Lab. We did the Series A with Atomico, right, from here, but it's in Greece, and the whole team is in Athens, and they don't have to move to London, but they can build this from everywhere.
It's interesting because I think it is a very topical point. Recently we had Tom Bloomfield, the founder of Monzo, coming to Cambridge and talking about the impact of Silicon Valley and being there and what the multiple you get of success as a result of being in Silicon Valley versus everywhere else. So he's biased because he's with Y Combinator.
Yep.
Y Combinator is definitely in Silicon Valley. But it's a really interesting point, but I think you all make great points. Let's move on from geography to funds, because funds have a role to play. Do you think they're becoming increasingly specialized or increasingly evolving because of circumstance? And I'm going to look to you, Andrea, and the reason why I say that is because you head up the NATO fund. Is that because of geopolitics or something else? So what's going on with funds? Are they becoming more specialized?
They're definitely becoming more specialized. The NATO Innovation Fund was started for a specific reason, which was mostly due with two reasons. One, deep tech in Europe was basically left to too few specialists, and there wasn't enough venture capital to go into hardware, semiconductor, system companies. And so basically NATO basically had the courage to admit that if we don't back this company, they will not be here, and both government and enterprises in Europe will not be able to have access to these strategic technologies. So they'll have to source them from the east of the west rather than having it locally. And so they stepped in to fill that market failure, what I would consider a market failure. We invest in funds as well as companies. So over the past 6 months, we looked at 300 funds, early stage fund. And I would definitely say that there is a specialization, particularly at the earlier stage, both from a geography as well as theme or sector. So it has become a much more fragmented market, where the fund sizes are much smaller at the earlier stage and much more specialized.
Interesting. Alan, would you agree?
I think that's one half of the story. So I agree with that half, but which is basically half? The venture market is becoming much more specialized in sector-specific funds, geo-specific funds, in stage-focused funds, climate tech, Nigeria only, seed stage only, right?
Captive funds.
And on the, call it maybe sub $500 million fund size, that is very much a specialization game. At the same time, I think Sequoia and Andreessen and all the biggest guys, are becoming these multi-stage, multi-geography agglomerators essentially, and they're leaving the MOIC game, right? They're going into the AUM game. They're basically going to be BlackRock, like they're going to try to be these giant financial institutions.
Interesting.
Which is fine, but the chairman of our fund at Endeavor is Reid Hoffman, who's a partner at Greylock, the guy who co-founded LinkedIn. And Reid told me very clearly when we started our fund 12 years ago, he said, look, in venture you have to pick. You can either be in the AUM Hall of Fame or in the MOIC Hall of Fame. You can't do both, right? You can't raise $10 billion and still make a 10x fund. So I think there's a tremendous amount of specialization going on in the smaller funds, and then you also have some of the biggest funds in the world just getting bigger and bigger.
Just consolidating. Wow, interesting. Laura, did you want to input into this?
I think one of the interesting trends that we're seeing is a lot more impact-led funds and funds which are specializing in investing in women or in underserved communities. And one of the things that we hope will happen in the next few years in the UK is a big liberalization of pension fund investment into alternative assets, which should bring a lot more domestic institutional capital into the market. That will come with very strong ESG requirements. So I think we're seeing that increasing specialization, which is neither sectoral nor geographic, but more around mission and who the founders are.
Yeah, so sector, stage, social, economic. Yeah, great point. So we've talked about geographies, we've talked about funds. Let's talk about founders and the entrepreneurial process. What's commoditizing? What's changing? In the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, obviously you talked about remote working, COVID, and how companies build companies, how people build companies. What's changing? What's now not a big deal anymore than it was 5 years ago in the entrepreneurial process? Maybe, Alan, you could start with that.
Sure. I think you referenced the guys from YC. I think if you compare today, I started working at Endeavor 18 years ago, right? So if you compare today to where we were a decade or two ago, the dissemination of knowledge available to startup founders is incredible, right? The blogs you can read, the podcasts you can listen to, you can access a lot of the kind of tips and tools around how to build a business in a very real way that you couldn't before. But the other thing that happened, particularly in this last kind of boom of 2020 and 21, is you expanded the number of people starting companies tremendously, right? So a lot has been written about tourist capital coming into the venture markets. Well, there's also a lot of tourist founders, right? Because it was sexy and cool to be an entrepreneur. Turns out it's still really, really hard to build a big company. And so I'd say in 2024, we're living through the chapter of the realization of a new generation of founders, of just how much tenacity, perseverance, determination, and resilience it actually takes to build a big business, because frankly, every overnight success story you read about in the headlines is 10 or 15 years in the making, right? And Endeavor knows this to be very fundamentally true. whether that's here in the UK or in Turkey or in Mexico, right? It's the same story everywhere.
Great response. Hands up, who's a founder in the audience? Who's a tourist founder?
Yeah.
Any funds? Hands up. Okay, great. Great. Who would like to go next? Laura?
I guess much more operationally than where you've gone, but two things I think have changed. One is PEO, so employers of record. Going international used to be a massive deal for scaling companies because you had to go international to get to grow sufficiently to raise, but huge opportunity to burn masses of runway, get it wrong. You want to test a bunch of markets and see where you've got fit and where you're going to get traction. And that came with a lot of risk and operational overhead. You've now got these businesses like Globalization and Partners as an example. There's a deal, there's a whole bunch where you can, in a quite simple way, hire staff in international markets with pretty flexible terms. And that, what we've seen, has been a real game changer, both for London companies that want to expand internationally, but also for international businesses that want to try out the London market. It's like a try before you buy, before they commit. So I think that's really changed the dynamics of international scaling. And then the trend for fractional, which we've also seen really growing in the last couple of years. So businesses being able to get much, much more experienced senior talent than they would be able to hire full time, but having a chief growth officer or a CFO 2-3 days a week who's been through multiple exits is so valuable for a scaling business.
Excellent point. Andrea, you're doing more deep tech. What's changed in the entrepreneurial process? Because before you were at Amadeus.
Yes, so I've been investing in deep tech for more than 25 years. Fundamentally, for all the reasons that we just covered, entrepreneurs have become incredibly more sophisticated. How does that have an impact is that if they make mistakes, they make new mistakes. They don't repeat the mistakes of the cohort of the companies that were created before them.
Great point.
So it speeds up development and acceleration because, as I said, the mistakes universe gets smaller a little bit with each generation.
Yeah, great point. The learning curve goes faster and faster. Okay, final question. The next wave of value creation, big question mark. By vertical, by place, what can you tell us, Andrea? 30 seconds each, I'm afraid.
We're supposed to say AI.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I'll be controversial and I'll probably say quantum computing.
Defense tech? Oh, quantum computing. In the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, or 50 years?
All of those. 5, 10, 15.
Really?
Not 50, much earlier than that.
Much earlier. And the combined with AI would just blow everything off. Okay. Alan?
So I will say AI, but I'll modify the answer. What I really think is going to change the most is human amplification or human augmentation. Basically, turning your one-day-a-week CFO into a super CFO because they have an AI assistant sort of amplifying what they're doing. Same for engineers, same for lots of different things. I think you'll see companies that can get built with far fewer people over time, and that's a very important consideration. Pros and cons to that, right?
Yes.
We don't have time to do the whole thing, but I think it's a very real trend that we'll see. I'm old enough to remember when VCs put on their website that they invested in mobile as a category, like mobile businesses, and then eventually mobile was just in everything. That's how AI is also going to be. It's just going to be in all of these businesses.
Great point. Laura?
We're out of time, so I'll be very quick. Climate and India.
Wow.
Ooh, good.
Great.
I like
Fantastic.
that. Punchy answer. Let's go to India.
That's very good. So we've talked about geographies, funds, founders, and the founding sort of entrepreneurial journey. And what's next? I mean, good value for money, no? Thank you so much for the distinguished panel. Thank you so much for your time.